The seventh bad habit of good companies is what I have labeled as the territorial impulse. More commonly, we would call it as turf wars. Actually, in many ways, this ought to be like the eighth bad habit, just like Stephen Covey has come out with the eighth habit as a new book. This is probably one of the most serious habits a company acquires. It is in the same league as the first habit I talked about, which is denial of new realities. And these two probably are the most paramount problems with all successful companies. So what does the territorial impulse mean? And there's a lot of literature in anthropology, in animal kingdom, about protecting your territory or turf. But from our viewpoint, it is a very simple definition. It is the affinity or loyalty and identity toward a functional discipline, which actually is transcending, it is above and beyond the loyalty and the identity of employee to the company itself and its vision and values, which means an employee believes like he or she is a human resource person first and a company employee second. He's an engineer first, company employee second. He's a scientist first, company employee second. And I find surprisingly each of the functions of business, whether those are R&D upstreaming functions, manufacturing on the other hand, or customer sales and support functions, every one of them has a stronger identity, allegiance, loyalty toward their function than toward the corporation. This is a fundamental issue, and how do you institutionalize their loyalty and their identity to the company so they think about the company more than about the function is a key challenge that the leadership of large corporations have to understand. So how does a company acquire this territorial impulse habit? The first thing in my observation, and some research is done, is when the promotion to the top is a political process. You don't know who is going to be selected as the CEO of the company or a business unit head, and given that, politics take over. So each functional area begins to fight for its survival and supremacy, with the worry that in fact, if a given function becomes, a person becomes a head of the company from that function, he or she will be subordinating other functions. And that's where the fights begin. I have an analog called the 50-story building. Think about all corporations organized like a 50-story building where 50th floor is a common lobby, first floor is a common lobby, but then you have 50 towers. You have the engineering tower, you have the sales and marketing tower, you have the customer support tower. If you're on the 4th floor of engineering tower, and if you want to meet with somebody on the 4th floor of the sales and marketing tower, how do you do it? Either you go down to the lobby and come up again, which is what I call an informal sort of a friendship communication coordination people do, bypassing the government, the bureaucracy of the company. Or you have to go up the elevator and cross over in the 50th floor, which is more a formal chain of command and control. In fact, there are times when those elevators seem to never come down, always going up, which is what I call the budgeting time. You never get on the elevator because the senior management has no time for anybody. They're negotiating among themselves who will get what piece of the pie for next year's budget or capital budgets. Now, the senior-most management on the 50th floor understands this problem. So they put together a temporary bridge. Have you noticed that thing? 4th floor people connected by a bridge to the 4th floor people from Tower A to Tower B to Tower C. It's called a task force. Have you heard of a task force in a company? Most companies have task force, either on an initiative or on an ongoing basis. And guess what? Here comes into the task force an engineer with a value system which is so radically different than the sales and marketing people with another value system so radical and different to customer support. The sales guy, as soon as he looks at the engineer, says, just as I imagined. The guy is a nerd. Look at the way he's dressed. If I have to show him to a customer, I got to clean him up first, right? See, that's how salespeople think about engineers. Engineer looks at the sales guy and says, just as I imagined, neatly dressed, slick guy, never trust a word the guy says. He will promise everything to the customer, I got to deliver all those things, you see. What I find is that these functional cultures are so embedded, either from college education or even from childhood upbringing, that they are more irreconcilable than getting the Germans and the French and the British to get together. I can transcend the religious cultures, the linguistic cultures maybe, and ethnic cultures more quickly, either at least to coexist them, if not to assimilate them, than I can do it, in fact, the business functions. And I believe all of this happens, my view, is because of the way we socialize in higher education and give signals. Sometimes there's a country bias, because there are many, many countries, especially Northern European countries, where selling is dirty. It is not the job that you encourage your son and daughter to go into, for example. It's not a noble profession, but you should be an engineer, interestingly. And we have all the jokes that we hear about. Now, in a large, complex organization, you have to organize by functional specialization, the Adam Smith principle of division of labor and specialization to increase your efficiency. But the more you organize functionally, the more you have a nightmare of these different functions working together. So the effectiveness goes down, as we call it in the academic world. And especially when the promotion is not clear, and therefore if an engineer rises to the top, what will be his view as a CEO? Has he dropped his cultural bias as an engineer when he becomes a CEO and sees the world in a more broader way? Or is he going to take his engineering approach to looking at the salespeople, the customer support people, and vice versa? And by the way, these debates are very vicious. In pharmaceutical companies, are you primarily a scientist who is out there to discover new drugs, to save many lives, to take care of a major problem in the society, such as nowadays HIV/AIDS, for example? I mean, that's your pride. That's how you became a scientist. That's how you became a medical doctor even, right? And therefore, you don't trust any salespeople like the detail people. You think salespeople are out there to promise what is not otherwise the right thing to do. So if you are a scientist rising at the top versus a sales and marketing rising at the top, you see a complete problem. And this Merck company went through that. Same thing in banking business. If you are an investment banking person versus a consumer banking person, you have two different cultural biases. So when the promotion to the top is not a clear, transparent thing as to who gets promoted why, a meritocracy system, in other words, but it is strictly a political process jockeying for who will emerge as the leader, this becomes much more, territorial protection becomes much more the reality. Second place where I see the territorial impulse or turf war begins is when the owner's culture is replaced by a large corporate culture. Generally, this happens when the family-run business ultimately sells the business, or it gives up its equity position for whatever reason. And if it is selling the business, it is merging with another large company. We have seen this in cosmetics. We have seen this in packaged goods industry. We have seen this in banks, etc. You see an enormous change in the culture. So you see community banks and their culture. And most of the community banks get organized in order to sell. They have 2-3 branches. A large bank, a national bank, buys them out. And now you see a complete change in terms of turf fights. And I've seen the same thing when at one time most of the department stores used to be family run. You would have a store like Kaufman's in Pittsburgh, or Rich's, for example, in Atlanta. And you will have many, many names like that, mostly one city oriented, family run businesses, very different culture. but then they are bought out by very large national companies like Federated Stores, or they are more like the Nordstroms of the world in some fashion, which is still run more like a family business. It seems to have more cultural, connectivity across different functions in the organization, but otherwise you see the typical territorial impulse rising in the process. You want to protect your turf by and large. Third thing is when a company's culture is dominated by one functional specialty. Are you an engineering-driven company? Are you, in fact, a manufacturing-driven company? Are you a customer-driven culture? And those are the typical problems. Because there, that function is elevated to a more elitist level. And everybody else is looked down. Everybody else is like the Rodney Dangerfield of the business world. And therefore, you can never get your promotion unless you are part of that function or you go through that function, whatever that one is. So, for example, in the packaged goods industry, it is the brand management system, interestingly. No matter what functional area you are specialist in, unless you put your time to manage the brand and become mini CEO, essentially, you cannot go to the top. That has its own consequences, although I'll talk about that as one of the solutions for this problem. Finally, when there is a poor post-merger integration, and you have seen this happen in airlines. So here is Allegheny Airlines buying out two very interesting, I would call fun cultures. One was Piedmont Airlines on the East Coast. Other one was called PSA on the West Coast. PSA actually was the pioneer of the no frills. Because it was California-centric airline, it really had all the flexibility within the state. It was not interstate regulation. So CAB had very little regulatory thing, which is the Civil Board of Aviation by and large, Civil Aviation Board. And it had all the people who were, flight attendants were also part-time Hollywood people. And they were allowed to make jokes and everything, fun, fun, fun. Piedmont was East Coast, but again had a very nice culture. Now these three companies get together with Allegheny buying out all three. The total airline is called now US Air, and guess what? The cultures died in the other two companies. And the turf war began to happen again. Who is going to succeed at the top, kind of an issue, right? And I've seen the same thing in a company called Wire and Plastics Products. Think about that name. And by the way, it is today called WPP Group. It was a shell corporation that was bought by Martin Soros, who is an icon in the industry of advertising and communication. And they began to acquire all founder-based ad agencies, public relations firms, companies like Young and Rubicam on the one hand, J. Walter Thompson on the other hand. And now you see those different cultures not being able to assimilate very well. So you have all the internal turf wars in the process. Which agency will be more succession planning wise, will win high-level management posts? It's a very tough job for Martin Soros to juggle all these different balls in the process, right? Not only it is a problem in terms of public relations firms think very differently than, for example, ad agencies, which think very differently than, for example, internet-based companies, which think very differently than the direct marketing companies, just goes on and on. But you also have the cultural differences, like the American approach to doing things versus the European approach versus the Asian approach, for example. So it's a very complicated organizational structure that they have to manage. What are the warning signs of territorial impulse? How do you know your company has this problem of turf wars? First one is huge dissension. Instead of one strong general in the military analog, the company now has a lot of headstrong lieutenants, all of whom want to go their own way. You clearly see this thing. By the way, the place where you see more of this, who am I to comment on this one, being an academic, is in the academic world. In fact, we have more of these problems between the business discipline versus the liberal arts discipline versus the engineering schools. They just don't talk to each other. And each one of them has a strong autonomous viewpoint. So just like as I mentioned in military, without a strong leadership at the top, the lieutenants begin to actually exercise their own cultural biases, which results into dysfunctionality. Second good indication as an early warning signal for you is indecision. In other words, the company gets paralyzed from making a decision. Decision making is an agonizing, if not impossible, process. This is further exacerbated where the company has become bureaucratic. Policies and procedures have taken over the corporate culture. And this has been the issue. By the way, dissension is the one place where I would even put General Motors. When Alfred Sloan created division structure, you have the Chevrolet division, Pontiac division, Buick division, Oldsmobile and Cadillac. They would fight among themselves. Just like at universities we do, as I mentioned. To make a decision at the corporate level is a nightmare, therefore. Whether you are a telephone company or whether you are a large automobile manufacturing company, doesn't make any difference by and large. And so that's the second major indication that how fast are you able to make a decision. If you look at both of these early signals, what does it say? That the leadership is delegated to functions or business units. It is not at the corporate level. There is no leader at the corporate level, essentially. So everybody is pulling in their own way. You have all these horses, but they're going in different directions, dissipating all their energy in the process. There is no jockey on the horse. There is no, in fact, a trainer, which is like a guide, essentially, an executive coach. There's none of that stuff. And therefore, there's a lot of dysfunctionality in the organization. Third good indicator about turf wars is confusion. The left hand does not know what the right hand is doing. There is no communication. There is no coordination. Each one is behaving in their own way. Fourth one is the most dangerous one, and I've seen this in companies, surprisingly, like before and after kind of a situation. The rank and file are unhappy and mentally resigned. Their bodies are there, but their mind is some other place. They know the company has great potential, but its leadership is unable to attain that potential. I saw this in telephone industry. I've seen this in electric utility industries. I've seen this in airline industry. In fact, industries where you see companies are in trouble, essentially, the significant emotive loyalty, the share of heart employees had for the company has gone away, because they all believe that the company has huge potential, but there's a lack of leadership at the top, by and large, to guide the company in the proper direction. So how do you break the territorial impulse or turf wars? I find it is all about internal marketing. The role of leadership is to internally communicate more and more and more constantly about how the vision, the values are all together. So create the identity and affinity toward the company's vision and values, and minimize the functional identity and affinity in the process. And some leaders are able to do it better than others, but it is all internal marketing. And I saw this culture in the heydays of McDonald's. Hopefully it is coming back. First of all, McDonald's selected their franchisees very carefully, even though they paid enormous sum of money for the franchise, $250,000 or more. They then put them through a training program lasting for more than a year. So would be the store managers. I have watched, for example, the rallies they have. So here is a young teenage boy or a girl. Think about what happens when he begins or she begins to work at McDonald's. A 10-cent raise drives that kid more than anything as an incentive. It's all peer group bonding, peer group pressure. So here is the teenager who will never have his room clean. Think about that. He always wakes up late Saturdays and Sundays, but if he becomes a McDonald's kid, he wakes up 4:45 in the morning sharp. He's out there cleaning and whistling. He's not my son or my daughter, probably. That's the transformation McDonald's was able to do among young minds. They bonded. Once they put on that cap, it's like a Superman suit. They change their identity completely. They forgot they're teenagers. They forgot they come from a given culture. They forgot, in fact, the schools they attend, all those identities, and suddenly they rise to a common McDonald's identity. By the way, the only place that better than McDonald's I found this thing is in the military. Military becomes a great equalizer and basically encourages people to give up their stereotypes and identities once you join the military. So you get an identity of a Marine or an identity of a Navy, not only in the beginning, but for the rest of your life, essentially. So I often used to say, if we really were serious about putting discipline in the country, we should make sure that every kid has a 2-year mandatory duty at a McDonald's, okay? Just like we used to create men out of army, army made men out of people kind of a thing, same idea, interestingly. Second one is a very key strategy, and I have recommended in a couple of companies, and it seems to have worked, which is to push the management out of their offices. They should be out there wandering among the stakeholders. Customers as stakeholders, investors as stakeholders, employees as stakeholders, suppliers as stakeholders, and definitely local communities in which you live, breathe, etc. So managing by wandering around was a phrase created. Tom Peters popularized it enormously as a management thinker, leader, etc. And I do believe there is something very valuable, that the more the management and senior management, especially that 50th floor I talked about, are less in their offices and more out into the field, the more they will identify with the company rather than their own function and a culture that way. Third, create cross-functional teams. And this is the one that is very common nowadays. In Toyota, it is called Toyota Production System, where you bring in cross-functional teams, all work on a common issue, problem, whatever it is. And cross-functional teams, unfortunately, as I mentioned, when you put together as a task force, often do not work with the kind of harmony that one would like to see. Some cultures, it is better that way. And usually the view is that the Asian culture is where the institution is more important than the individual. So maybe it works better for Toyota, maybe for a Korean company, maybe for a Chinese or an Indian company. But I'm not so optimistic that this is the strategy that works well in the Western cultures, especially in America, where we believe individual is more important than the institution by and large. I like the next strategy, reorganize around customers and products. And this is what Procter & Gamble ended up doing. Procter & Gamble was functionally organized in its early days with only one product called Ivory soap. Competition was coming like Lux from Unilever. How do you compete that one? Management challenge was to come out with a second brand. Nobody wanted to support a second brand because they thought that's going to minimize the growth of Ivory soap. A smart young man, directly reporting to the CEO and the chairman, somehow got internal buying going, internal marketing, got the cooperation for each functional areas, manufacturing people, procurement people, whatever they were, and somehow got the second brand going by positioning it as a facial soap, whereas Ivory was a bathing soap. Ivory was a family soap at that time. Each family member used the same soap, whereas as a facial soap, it's called Camay, which was a brand name that was created, will be primarily individually used for my facial complexion. Suddenly, two brands both existed. Both grew the market, protected against Unilever's main brand emerging called Lux. And that led to the idea that brand management is a coordination function cross-functionally. And P&G is the pioneer, along with many packaged goods companies. And today, P&G is finding that in addition to brand management now, it needs to organize around accounts or customers, which I mentioned earlier. Out of nowhere, Walmart has become their largest customer, began the partnering relationship with Walmart when I think the business was under $500–600 million. I would say it probably was in the late 80s, early 90s. In 2005, it is about $11 billion business. This is a very difficult process. to organize around customers. It's easier to organize around products. And companies like Lucent has failed trying to do that thing. Nortel has failed. At IBM, Lou Gerstner, when he came in, after the company was in trouble, he found the functional loyalties were enormous, especially it was a technology-driven company. So he injected customers in all the meetings, strategic planning meetings, and brought about a significant change. Those are the kinds of things that companies have to learn how to do it by and large. Next area to really reduce territorial impulse or suppress it would be through automation and integration, which is why you have seen the IT practices like ERP have become so popular, whether it is SAP, BON, Oracle, because it integrates cross-functional communication and coordination function. So somehow the IT sitting in the back is able to bring people together. Similarly, supply chain management is to integrate outside suppliers. CRM is customer relationship management, database management, which is to integrate the customer-facing side. These three processes of automating and integrating, integration is a key word around here, has brought about more, in fact, coexistence, co-understanding, if not full-blown cooperation or integration among different functions, which is why most of these have become necessities even in small and medium enterprises now. Rotate leadership across functional responsibilities, which is the next recommendation. In other words, you create a corporate leadership institute, something similar to the very famous workout program in Crotonville in New York by General Electric. And you have people coming from different businesses, different functions together. They work together, they have a common challenge, and you begin to have them leave their functional identity and gain more and more the business or corporate identity. And that's what you do through leadership institutes. And your career path is based upon that. In other words, the expectation is that people who are selected to go to those leadership institutes are high potential. They are the next generation leaders of the companies. And obviously, they have bonded together very well in a social setting outside of the work area. And hopefully, they know each other intimately. So any one of them, when he or she emerges as a leader, probably would have tolerance for other people in the process. Personal assessment and coaching is the other recommendation, that you can actually have a mirror in the face of the senior executive, pretty much showing them through assessment and executive coaching that they are really much more loyal to the function they belong to, as a scientist, for example, as a manufacturer, for example, as a salesperson, that they need to actually become more and more loyal or identify with the company by and large. So in conclusion, territorial impulse refers to affinity and identity to a functional discipline such as engineering, science, marketing, sales, above identity and affinity with the company and its vision and values. Territorial impulse arises due to organizational design, the way we are organized, the 50-story building I talked about. When a family culture is replaced by a corporate culture, corporate ownership. When the company is dominated by a single function, it is engineering culture, it is sales culture, whatever it is. And when there is a poor post-merger integration. And as you know, most mergers don't succeed because it is all turf wars between the two merging entities by and large. Who stays, who leaves, who gets promoted, and all the debate. To break the habit of territorial impulse, it is important to invest in internal marketing, which means more internal communication, more internal leadership is very key. To push the management out of their ivory towers, to create permanent cross-discipline teams, which is harder, good idea, but harder to really get benefit out of it, my view. To reorganize around customers or products, and I find this is a very viable mechanism. To automate and integrate functions, and to rotate leadership across functions. So once I am in charge of your function, even though I'm not an expert, I have to struggle. I have to really win over the people in that function So I begin to rise above my own functional identity by and large. And it works. I've seen this rotational mechanism very useful. It's like going to different countries, experiencing the country, so you become a world citizen as opposed to an American view or an Indian view or a Chinese view of the world kind of a thing, if you have lived only in the country, right? That's the kind of point I'm making. So what we are going to do now is to shift to the last area. We have completed the 7 bad habits. What we need to talk about is not how the habits are formed, how do you detect them, warning signals, and how do you break them, which is sort of a corrective issue. Best thing is to prevent it. As I mentioned, an ounce of prevention, as somebody has said, is better than a pound of cure. So how can a company prevent itself from developing bad habits? Is it possible to do that? So my view is that yes, it is very possible. And we will go through each one of the 7 bad habits and show a couple of key initiatives companies have taken to prevent those bad habits. The 7 bad habits are, first one, denial, as I mentioned, probably one of the most dangerous bad habits. And the one way to really prevent that one is to constantly challenge the assumptions and orthodoxies. And the 2 companies that have done well is Toyota, on the one hand, constantly, in fact, thinking about the world as future, anticipating the future, rather than holding on to the tradition by and large. And the other company is Citicorp. Citicorp basically is driving its culture from that viewpoint. Second area, of course, is to use matrix that encourage the change. And at 3M Company, this was a very simple tactic used by Jake Jacobson, I think was the name of the CEO. And he came out with the idea that based on an audit, that something like 90% of the revenue was coming from the same products and the same geographies that were in place 5 years ago. So he said, where is the innovation here? Where is the change? Rather than mandate something else, he simply incentivized each division head, which is a profit center, to say, I would like to see like 35% of your revenue coming from markets that don't exist today in the next 5 years. And I would like to see 25% of your revenue coming from products in the next 5 years that don't exist today. And apparently, the incentives were put in place, the measurements were put in place as a way of bringing about a change. And 3M Company has positioned itself better in the future, surprisingly more in expanding their geographical base, like the Asia market, for example, more so than in inventing new products. But we are a pretty good company on both ways, is my view. How do you prevent arrogance, which is the second bad habit we had talked about? The only way you can prevent bad habit, arrogance, is to put the mirror in front of the senior leaders. And a wife is not going to be, or a spouse is not going to be the good person here. A friend will not be a good person here. They will not be brutally honest about your weaknesses. So I strongly recommend an executive coach. An executive coach who has a detached commitment. I have a whole book in this area called Clients for Life. How do you become a trusted advisor to senior most leaders? Remember, in the old days, kings used to rely on theologians, priests, philosophers, right? And when democracy came in, monarchy was gone, some of the best advisors were lawyers like Harry Hopkins. And then when we got the industrial and the mercantile age, guess what? Some of the best advisors were bankers like JP Morgan. Today, some of the best advisors have been management consultants, individuals, not companies. And of course, the next one are executive coaches. These coaches begin to guide you to get more potential out of you. So it basically minimizes arrogance. Arrogance in your body language, arrogance in your behavior, just goes on and on. And analog here is a sports analog. I like that very much. Because best place you see coaching taking place is that here is a great raw talent of an athlete, whether it's a cross country skiing, whether it's in fact just track running, whether it's tennis on the one hand, basketball, football, makes no difference. The coach's job is to harness the talent of that individual in a positive way. so that the outcome for the game and outcome for the individual itself is remarkable. And you create icons out of these ordinary human beings. You create basically sort of personality brands, especially on the positive side. And we know so many of these athletes who have become world-class in the process. And it's really the coaching that gets more excellence out of the human being. So I believe in that one. And I already talked about the trusted advisor in one of my books. Second way to prevent arrogance is to discourage the star syndrome. And I believe this is a very serious problem in America, especially. As soon as a company succeeds, we are such an individually driven culture as opposed to institutionally driven culture. We immediately put the leader of that company pretty much and praise that individual and make him or her bigger than life. Now they begin to believe this stuff, surprisingly. They get reinforced because they believe, yeah, I must have done that thing. So generally, it says that rather than have the leader of the company personify the excellence of the company, it should be either a collective identity of all employees, so you have an identity of the company rather than the individual, which is the Southwest Airlines, where everybody is a personality, everybody is a hero, rather than one individual who becomes a star. Or pretty much, in fact, institute a quiet leadership as a positive message. And this you have seen in Jim Collins' second book that he wrote, Good to Great, for example. He's absolutely commenting that world-class CEOs are not necessarily very flamboyant, are not necessarily one who splurge a lot, who really flaunt, essentially. But they're really quiet leaders in many ways. They're ordinary people. If you met them on a street, you would not even recognize that they are really icons for their industry or for the company by and large. And I'm a very strong advocate of quiet leadership. In fact, my view is that in a democratic society, more you ascend to a powerful position, whether you are a judge, a police officer, a professor, president of the country, or a CEO, makes no difference. The more you are in a more powerful position, the more modest you should become for your own survival. People expect you to become more modest as you gain more power. But the whole natural tendency would be the reverse, essentially. So these are the two recommendations about how to prevent arrogance. This will be harder to prevent than, my view, denial, probably. To prevent complacency, the third bad habit. Again, I picked two. I'm sure there are more, but these are two most obvious and good ones. Strong operational matrix. In other words, complacency arises when we are not measuring things right or not measuring enough in detail to aggregate a measure. And I tell you, the companies like FedEx and UPS have absolutely incredible operational matrix. And therefore, they're constantly efficient, no matter how big they have grown. From humble beginnings to the largest multinationals today, both companies are really showcased in the world. And you see opposite almost, partly because of regulation, partly because it's a monopoly business or a government business. You don't see the same culture in postal systems. The only thing in postal system like US Postal Service one measures very well is the operational efficiency about how many mail pieces are quality assurance, which means they are delivered at a place and a location, but not necessarily by time. And they're pretty good at that. In fact, I tell you, the number of pieces US Postal Service delivers, like billion pieces or some ungodly number, it's a mind-boggling with such a slow and low error rate. They're like Six Sigma almost kind of a thing, right? The other company I found fascinating in one of my books has been Cisco's food services company, SYSCO, not the technology company. And these guys are very operationally driven. Their customer is the chef in a restaurant, in a hotel, etc. And they basically support the chef's needs even in a crisis mode. And there are some interesting stories that I learned from them to really begin to say that they really never are likely to become complacent. Second measure is to use performance-based compensation, which means compensation is not by seniority. It is not by, in fact, the normal increase, in the annual raises, cost of living adjustment, but it is actually by what you have done, meritocracy if you call it, but performance-based compensation is the word. And obviously General Electric practices this enormously, especially in recent times, since Jack Welch came and transformed GE culture by and large. The fourth bad habit is competency dependency. Again, how do we prevent that? In this case, surprisingly, there are more solutions that I have found in the literature and my own views. First one is what is called constructive destruction. Now, this is a very interesting oxymoron phrase created by a well-known economist called Joseph Schumpeter. His view about capitalism was that capitalism as a competitive market process will constantly destroy the incumbents and will always move the industry toward the next plateau by innovation, by differentiation, however they do it. And therefore, he believed that capitalism was the right mechanism to constantly re-energize a company, the industry, etc. So it never has a sunset. So constant migration to the next generation technology, the company should be doing that mandatorily. This is not like a small corporate venture on the side, as people have recommended, where company money is put aside to come out with new ideas. It simply says you must improve on your existing technology to the next generation of technology and migrate the customers, migrate the operations from the current to the future. And the only place where I've seen this happen by sheer force of technology alone is, as you know, the Intel story about the microprocessor, where Moore's law basically said that you have to migrate from 286 to 386 chip to 486, then the Pentium series, and then Celerum or whatever they call it now, etc. You can pretty much see the migration. It may reach a limit after a while, but still the notion is that it has so many cycles of sort of a cannibalization, if you wanted to use the word, but migration is the word. And by the way, IBM practiced this in mainframe computing days. So while 650 machine would be still very viable, operating quite well, has more engineering life, they would come out with a 7070, 7090 architecture, show to the customers how it is cheaper and better, and therefore make the previous generation obsolete. Then they came out with 360, 3300 series, and the rest is a history kind of a thing. In Japan, this is basically a philosophy, a religion, and it's called Kanban, which means there is no upper limit, which is why I don't like best practice studies, because even the best practice may not be at a next generation. It is what we know today, right thing to do. In fact, Kanban basically means continuous improvement. There is no upper limit of performance or excellence by and large as a philosophy. So that's what constructive destruction is, one. Second one is diversify competency to different applications, which says that you are trapped into your competency, but you can still have business viability by simply looking that competency into domains, vertical markets, or applications where nobody thought about it. So the breakthrough here is connecting dots which nobody could connect before. And this has happened pretty much by a company, brand name called Arm & Hammer, in baking soda. Baking soda actually has a declining life cycle. As the countries become more and more affluent, they stop making breads at home, they buy from a bakery, so there is no home baking soda market in the long run. But they discovered that baking soda has two more properties besides baking. One, of course, it's a great cleanser, and the other one, of course, is it's a great odor killer. So they've come out with all these applications as a cat litter box in your refrigerator, for example. Similarly, making toothpaste out of baking soda, laundry detergent out of baking soda, just goes on. And therefore, in this particular case, at least at a product level, if not at a company level, you are able to somehow prevent the trap that you have found yourselves in. DuPont has done the same thing with nylon. Nylon was primarily created for substituting silk that stopped coming from China for Western women's silk stockings. It was a raw material substitution. World War II comes. The factories are converted for war production. Same nylon material now is used for parachute landing, making these threads for parachute. War is over. They apply it for home furnishings, wall-to-wall carpeting, for example, the draperies, furniture. Then they've gone into football fields, and there is never an end to life cycle of nylon. Even though competency is the same, different applications re-energizes that competency. And they are doing the same thing with a more recent material called Kevlar. Extend core competency to emerging markets and segments, which is another way out. And the best story I can tell you is obviously Avon products. In all Western countries, women are no longer homemakers, they are breadwinners, earning money by selling Avon products, mostly cosmetics, door to door, or in a party setting. Nobody has the time. And the doors get slammed now. Nobody is home anymore. Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, who is home? Both spouses are working. And given that scenario, while the phenomenon is plateauing in terms of door-to-door selling in advanced countries, it is absolutely the growth platform in emerging economies. Countries like Brazil, Avon has like 400,000 sales agents. Then you have China staring at them, India, Thailand, Indonesia, just goes on, where for the first time women are empowered to become economically independent. So it's all about empowering women in emerging countries from the traditional lifestyles to also becoming a wage earner or a breadwinner in the process. And that's, again, you can expand in the process. Now the next one is competitive myopia. How do you prevent competitive myopia? And again, the best way to do it is broaden the definition of competition. Myopia has reduced your vision, so you need to have something like a LASIK surgery, get back 20/20 vision, which basically says broaden your definition. And the way to do it probably is the only framework that has become most comprehensive and probably the best framework about understanding competition is what is called the 5 forces of competition by Michael Porter, where not only your immediate competitors in your face, which are direct competitors like Coke versus Pepsi, etc., we talked about, but actually you begin to see new entrants, peripheral vision. You see substitute technologies becoming competition. You see customers becoming competition, and you see suppliers becoming competition. So it broadens the definition of competition, and therefore you can see competition coming from all 5 angles by and large. Acquire a peripheral disruptive niche competitors. Cisco has done that quite a good job. Since innovation happens, disruptive innovation, outside the incumbents into small niche companies. This is the Schumpeter model that we talked about earlier. Cisco Systems identifies them very early and begins to either adopt them into the company. So their competency begins to become revitalized, and the definition of competitive vision begins to broaden. So it has both the impact on core competency itself, as well as, in fact, the impact definition of competition, both places. Enter markets from where future competition will come. And we talked about this earlier. India, China, and the Goldman Sachs report, which says that Brazil, Russia, India, China together will become larger economies by 2050 compared to all advanced economies. So that is where the future competition is going to come, by being there now strategically, knowing how they serve their domestic markets profitably. Then they have the expansion things in their mind. You can learn a lot. So these are the 3 mechanisms to prevent competitive myopia. Next one is volume obsession. And again, 3 recommendations I have. One is set up a volume as well as a margin-based compensation, especially for salespeople, but also your operation people, because operation is the cost side, sales is the price side, as well as the leadership on top. If all those 3 entities are incentivized to preserve and protect margins, while they grow, which means the top line, as it is growing, the bottom line begins to shrink. In other words, what you have is going forward more increase in the margins, gross as well as operating margins. That is what it says, that unless you put incentives in place, you will be driven by the top line primarily, and therefore you will sacrifice the bottom line. And in this case, the idea is that you should not be sacrificing the bottom line for the sake of top line growth. Next one is make procurement a strategic function. As I have mentioned several times, biggest cost center is not within the company, but it is outside the company with your suppliers. As much as 65–70% of the total cost is cost of goods sold, as it is called in retailing or procurement. And again, therefore, retailers are much better at this game than manufacturers, such as Walmart. Among the manufacturers, the world-class company around here is Toyota Motors through its lean operations, as well as supplier nurturing, supplier investing into suppliers, suppliers being extensions of your employees kind of a notion, and that seems to work very, very well. Last strategy around here is migrate to higher margin products or services through usually acquisitions. And Procter & Gamble has done it as a corporate strategy, that as you begin to do business with Walmart, they will put pressure on your margins. So can you get out of product lines which are ultimately very low margins, like fruit juices, for example, Crisco shortening, get out of those products and add instead products with much higher margins like cosmetics, personal care items, maybe over-the-counter drugs. And then you shift the channel, because the cosmetics usually sold through department stores in the US. The gross margin requirement is 250 to 300% ex-factory to retail price. Drugs are mostly sold through drugstores, again a little higher margin. If you can shift both of them through mass merchandisers or discount chains like Walmart, you don't need to surrender all your margins. A 40–50% margin at Walmart would be very acceptable. You pocket the rest of the margin out of 250–300% margin, and what you have seen therefore is Procter & Gamble making a very aggressive play to buy out a hair coloring company called Clairol. Before that one, they bought Georgia as a for perfume company, Oil of Olay, for example. They made a hostile takeover almost in Germany, a company called Wella, which is again in the hair coloring business, by and large, hair care business. And of course, they have gone into very early before that one, buying out Richardson Merrill, a pharmaceutical company, mostly because of its over-the-counter products like a Vicks VapoRub, for example. So I think it's a great strategy as a way of, in fact, you still deliver volume without sacrificing your margins. Last bad habit is called territorial impulse, which is mostly turf wars. So how do you prevent that? Best strategy I find is implement predictable and transparent succession planning. Most of the turf wars begin in a transition, uncertainty, merger acquisitions. But if you had well articulated, highly predictable, people understand what their roles and responsibility will be after the transition as compared to before the transition. Inject external stakeholder as a bonding mechanism. So rather than fighting internally, you create a common, not only enemy in this case, but an objective. Common enemy would be a competitor, and you rally behind that. Or a common stakeholder would be a customer or a shareholder, any one of them, to create a coalition among the functional turfs. And this is what Lou Gerstner ended up doing, as I mentioned earlier, at IBM. After IBM got in trouble, that he began to get all of the functional disciplines together to focus on customers by and large. Third recommendation to prevent impulse, territorial impulse or turf wars is career path management from dominant function to other functions. In other words, if a company is going to be engineering driven, then let engineers run all functions. So you only recruit people from the engineering disciplines. While they're working as engineers first few years, put them immediately into other functions, so they begin to manage the IT function, Some of them rise to the sales organization, they become salespeople also. Some of them go into customer support. But the common bond is that we are all engineers. And therefore, they begin to have less turf wars among themselves. So specialty chemicals, have seen this happen quite often. Everybody has to be a chemist to really be in this business. And therefore, they begin to do sales function, they begin to do service function, etc., especially in highly specialized specialty chemicals, like oil demulsification, in getting oil and water out at the oil level, oil well level by and large. And in academic institutions is where I see that happening more. Once you are a professor, but you become an administrator, so you become the department head of a discipline. Now you become a dean, so you are more broadly based of a given college. Then you become the provost, much broader responsibility, and then eventually, in fact, you become the president. And of course, engineering institutions like MIT, Georgia Tech would have the science and technology bias. On the other hand, liberal arts universities like Princeton, Yale would have those biases, for example. Whatever it is, everybody understands that is the culture of this particular academic institution. Carnegie Mellon, Caltech, you can clearly see. In economics, we have seen this thing. A Chicago school, an economist, a view about economics, a Chicago school is very different than, for example, a Harvard school of economic thinking at Harvard school. That's what I'm referring to around here. So in summary, we have the 7 bad habits. Denial of new realities, number 1, probably one of the most dangerous bad habits. Arrogance. Third one is complacency, or becoming, success breeds failure, essentially. Competency dependence, competitive myopia, volume obsession, and territorial impulse or turf wars. And this particular book that I have written, I have learned a lot in the process. What I find is that all good companies on their way to success acquire one or more of these 7 bad habits. And they are, to repeat again, denial, arrogance, complacency, competency dependence, competitive myopia, volume obsession, and territorial impulse. In this presentation, I have discussed how each habit is acquired by good companies, what are the warning signals you should look for in a company, and how to break that habit. Ultimately, it is all about leadership. My view is that the job of the leader in a company is to constantly monitor the company's health, like a good doctor would do, and prevent it from learning bad habits through regimentation, such as exercise and diet. However, if a bad habit is discovered, it should be promptly destroyed or corrected. The best cure for a bad habit is no cure at all. It basically says that prevention is better for the company than acquiring the habit. In other words, it is preventing the company from acquiring the bad habit as a process is much better than allowing the habit to emerge and then try to fix the problem. Thank you very much.
Dr. Sheth, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. Other experts have suggested that the failure of companies is a natural process of evolution, an inevitable part of the life cycle of the birth and death of companies.
Right.
Clearly, you do not agree.
I definitely don't agree the birth and death cycle, the human mortality being generalized to institutional mortality, because institutions always provide birth and death through succession planning. The leaders of the corporations may die, but the company survives, institution survives. We have seen this for religion, we have seen this for governments, we have seen this in fact for education, any institution by and large, So that really, therefore I do believe that this generalization of humans' mortality into corporate world makes no sense. Clearly one aspect. There's a second theory we have evolved in management literature, which has to do with survival of the fittest. In other words, it's not the inevitability of birth and death cycle, but it simply says that the pressures of competition will make some companies not survive and other companies will survive. I think there is some truth to that. It's more true than the birth and death theory, but I don't think it touches the full totality of the reality out there. It's not as holistic a view about the world. It is almost like 5 blind men touching the elephant. And if I touch the tail, I think it's a rope. If I touch the feet, I think it's a tree trunk. If I touch the nose, I think it is something else. Or if I touch the ears, I think it's a fan. See, I get different perspectives, right? Mm-hmm. I think the population ecology theory, as it is called, which is survival of the fittest, is into that category. I do believe that there is so much of evidence to the contrary, both for birth and death cycles. I mean, companies have survived for 300 years, 400 years, for example. And the survival of the fittest theory, there's so much of contrary evidence out there that I think we need to have additional perspectives, And that's what I'm trying to do, that companies don't necessarily die, really they acquire bad habits.
I see. You suggest that all good companies learn bad habits as they become more successful. Is this strictly an American phenomenon, or is this universally true?
Oh, clearly, acquiring bad habits is a universal phenomenon. There are no cultural differences. I do believe, however, that there are specific habits maybe more exaggerated or more prevalent in one culture compared to other cultures. Mm-hmm. I do believe the habit of arrogance is much more prevalent in the American culture than the European culture. And that's because in America, we give absolute powers to one individual. For example, most companies pre-Sarbanes-Oxley Act, the governance, corporate governance changes, but even afterwards, you see the chairman, the CEO, and the president all under one person. In Europe, with the managing directorship system, clearly the chairman is always a non-executive, outside person. Secondly, the notion is that the managing director is really equal, but one above all equals, which means you have a director in charge of finance, a director in charge of marketing, a director in charge of production, and they're all directors, and then he becomes like the managing director, Mm-hmm. Like in a partnership of law firms, Mm-hmm. They're all much more egalitarian. So no one individual is made the icon, the star, to create arrogance. Clearly there's one difference. Mm-hmm. The second difference is the Japanese are, I think, a lot more complacent. And that comes because of the tradition, historical of the monarchy system. Large corporations out of Japan were basically extensions of the monarchs. They're called zaibastus. We bless these families to carry out the Japanese, nationalism kind of a thing, whether it's a Toyota group, Mitsubishi group, Sumitomo, all those companies, right? There are about 12 of them. There, the company takes on the responsibility of taking care of the employees. So they become paternalistic. They worry about how will I get them married? How will I provide their housing, It's like we worry with entitlement of social welfare things, In the process, therefore, Japanese tend not to fire very quickly. Mm. It's not as much performance-based management, in other words. Japanese have more underemployment, more cost inefficiency. Now, here is a country that leads the IT world, right? They do more consumer electronics, mm-hmm. more PC, but they don't use it themselves. Most Japanese corporations are not really that automated and integrated as we are, for example, in America, So there's clearly a difference there, I find, right? The turf fights, again, for the same set of reasons, are much more prevalent and maybe more obvious in US. In US, we do it openly. Okay? We don't mind if the world watches us. There's a videotaping of our turf wars, okay? Or reported in business press like Wall Street Journal. It's okay. Whether it's between father and son, like, at AIG, what happened, Hank Greenberg phenomenon, or the Toyo corporations, Kozlowski's, the flamboyant behavior, let it come out, kind of a thing. Whereas turf wars usually are more subtle in Europe. You don't display them. You do it behind the scenes, kind of a thing. And turf wars are generally considered discrediting the institution in Japan or in Asian culture by and large, So there, it is a tendency that is minimized as a part of your recruiting process. If you have the tendency to be political, then they don't even recruit you, kind of a thing. So, more homogenization takes place on that side. So there is another difference. So I'm sort of more intrigued about the 7 bad habits, not among existing advanced countries like the European Union countries, America, Canada, and in Japan, and maybe Korea. But I'm sort of curious about what will be the bad habits of emerging economies and companies out of that one. Like India and China and Brazil, as they become global enterprises, as they become household words, will they acquire the same bad habits, or will they have their own cultural bias? I'm not so sure. I think both of these countries are so contemporary, modern, they're not bringing the legacy of their old cultures in their business dealings. They're very westernized, in my view. So I think their habits will be looking more like American habits, okay? That's my forecast, despite their cultural, heritages. Would be interesting.
Isn't prevention a better method than correction? Why don't companies put processes in place that prevent the learning of bad habits?
There's no question that prevention is a better method, whether it's in personal health or whether it's in corporate health, whether it's in personal survival and growth, same thing, no question. But just as we know in the human behavior, prevention is harder. I mean, we all know that we should diet and exercise, but we don't do it. We don't make that into a habit. So what happens is that the positive habits one should be having, which are preventative, we tend not to patronize. When negative habits take over, essentially, by and large. So it requires sort of a more an intervention approach, as opposed to an evolutionary approach. And to me, prevention is the one companies should be investing more into. And the place where you will see more prevention as a strategy from acquiring bad habits are likely to be in new companies, greenfield, first-time large enterprises, So one would hope that prevention would be put in place at Google more so than at Microsoft, and Microsoft more so than IBM, the typical generational gap kind of a thing. And I hope that happens because prevention is clearly less expensive, less traumatic. If you do, let's say you have a heart attack and you do surgery, you're not the same person afterwards. I mean, you function, correct, but you're not the same person.
Right.
Prevention is better. Not to have a heart attack is much better than fixing a heart problem, kind of a thing. So that's where I'm leaning toward, that one. And I'm also as puzzled as you are as to why companies can't institute prevention approaches to acquiring these 7 bad habits.
Well, thank you very much. It's really been fascinating. We'll see you again next time.
Thank you.